I had exactly $412.36 in my checking account, 6 fresh surgical stitches under my sweatshirt, and a padded envelope on the passenger seat with my late father's name typed across the front in block letters. 2 days earlier, my husband had emptied our joint reserve account. My younger sister had smiled through a donor luncheon as if nothing was wrong. And the board of the Charleston Maritime Foundation I had helped build was preparing to vote me out over a finance scandal I didn't create. I kept missing turns because the pain medication made me foggy and because, if I'm honest, I have always been a little too good at hoping people will explain themselves before they destroy me. The envelope held a Navy USB drive and a note in my father's handwriting, for when they decide you will fight back. By then, they already had. Let me take you back. My name is Nora Bell. I was 41 years old, living in Charleston, South Carolina, and working as Director of Operations for the Lowcountry Maritime Heritage Foundation, a polished nonprofit that preserved old boats, hosted education programs for public schools, and raised money from the sort of donors who liked historic causes as long as the champagne stayed cold. I was good at my job because I noticed details other people skipped. Insurance renewals, permit dates, grant compliance, invoice sequences. I could tell when something was wrong by the rhythm of a spreadsheet before I could prove it with a calculator. My flaw was less professional. I let ugly things sit too long because I preferred order to confrontation. That is how people like my husband, Grant, survived beside people like me for years. 3 weeks before the board tried to remove me, I had emergency surgery for a ruptured gallbladder. It was not dramatic, just painful and inconvenient and badly timed. I spent 4 days in St. Francis Hospital and another 10 at home under strict instructions not to lift anything heavier than a grocery bag. The Foundation's annual Founders Harbor Gala was 10 days away. It was our biggest public event of the year. The night donors wrote checks with extra zeros after the wine service. Grant told me not to worry. My sister Elise told me she would step up and cover the social side. That phrase should have warned me. Elise was 37, beautiful in the polished, expensive way that photographs well and ages slowly. Growing up, she had been the golden child because she made every room easier for other people. Teachers adored her. Men volunteered to carry boxes for her. My mother used to call me reliable and Elise radiant, as if one daughter had been built for use and the other for display. The first vivid lesson came when I was 14 and Elise was 10. We had a piano recital at church. I practiced for weeks and played perfectly. Elise forgot half her piece, smiled, laughed, and started over. On the drive home, my mother said, "Nora, nobody likes a girl who looks that serious all the time. Elise makes people feel comfortable." I learned something ugly that night. Excellence could be invisible if someone prettier failed charmingly beside you. The second lesson came 20 years later at my own rehearsal dinner. I was carrying seating charts and trying to fix a florist mistake when Grant took the folder from my hands and said, low enough that only I could hear, "You're amazing at the boring parts, Nora. That's your gift." Then he kissed my cheek and went back to the table where people laughed louder around him than they ever did around me. Calm cruelty rarely announces itself. Sometimes it sounds like praise. Grant worked in private wealth consulting. He knew how to speak in polished half-truths. He never shouted. He redirected. He softened. He made extraction feel like inevitability. When we married, I had a condo my father helped me buy and a retirement account with modest but steady savings. Over 11 years, most assets blurred together the way they do when one spouse says, "It's simpler this way," and the other spouse is too tired to ask who simplicity really serves. After my surgery, while I slept in a recliner because it hurt to lie flat, Grant handled what he called temporary cash flow restructuring. He moved funds between accounts, spoke to our CPA, and told me several times not to stress because stress slowed healing. I believed him because sick people often accept the nearest calm voice. Then came the call from our board chair, Vivian Mercer, at 7:12 on a Monday morning. "Nora," she said, "too brisk for kindness. We have a serious issue. There appear to be unauthorized reimbursements and donor hospitality charges tied to your credentials." I sat up too quickly and felt pain pull through my side. "What charges?" roughly $286,000 over 11 months. I actually laughed once because the number was so absurd. I had spent the prior week dividing pills into a plastic organizer and wondering whether I could tolerate toast. Vivian continued, "There will be an emergency governance meeting Friday. If you miss this, you lose everything." There it was. The clock trigger, clean and cold. I asked her to send every document they had. She said legal counsel was already involved. 10 minutes later, I logged into the Foundation server from home and found my access limited. Not fully blocked, just narrowed. Enough to slow me down. Enough to tell me someone had planned this. By noon, my personal banker called. He sounded embarrassed. "There's also an issue on the home equity line," he said. "Your husband signed a restructuring request and indicated you were aware. I was under anesthesia last week." A pause. "I think you should come in." I checked our household reserve account next. 0. Closed. I checked the emergency fund my father had insisted I keep separate even after marriage. 0. Transferred out 2 days earlier into a consulting LLC I had never heard of. Bell Harbor Strategies. Registered agent, Elise Rowan, my sister. For a full minute, I just stared at the screen. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's house, moving carefully because every bump in the road tugged at my stitches. Elise was there in my kitchen apron from 5 years earlier, slicing lemons as if she belonged to every room she entered. Grant arrived 10 minutes later, composed, expensive, carrying concern like a tailored accessory. My mother took one look at my face and said, "Try not to make this theatrical." That sentence will outlive her in my memory. Grant sat across from me at the breakfast table and folded his hands. There are explanations. Elise added softly, "Nora, don't spiral before you know the context." The context, it turned out, was fraud with excellent posture. Grant said Bell Harbor Strategies was a temporary intermediary vehicle for donor cultivation expenses and sponsorship reimbursements. Elise said she had only lent her name to help clean up the paperwork because the foundation systems were old-fashioned. My mother asked whether I had considered how bad public conflict would look for the family right before Gala Week. I asked one question. Why is my money in Elise's LLC? Grant did not answer directly. He said, because your accounts had cleaner liquidity. Cleaner liquidity. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think jargon can replace morality. I put the phone face down. Then I stood up and left before the pain in my side or the anger in my throat made me say something useless. That night I searched old files at home, not because I had a plan yet, but because motion felt better than shock. Grant had been careful about the foundation records, but he had always underestimated what I kept in paper. Contracts, earlier bylaws, old board packets, donor pledge memos. My father, who had died 18 months earlier, used to joke that every family needs one person who saves the boring things because boring things win lawsuits. At 10:40 p.m., while looking for a prior insurance rider in the hall closet, I found his old shaving kit inside a banker's box marked boat registrations. That was strange because my father had lived across town until he died, and I had packed his things myself. Stranger still was the rigid shape tucked under the lining. Inside was a Navy USB drive and a single folded note. For when they decide you won't fight back. The drive contained 3 folders. The first held scanned trust documents with my father's signature and the name Bell Shore Preservation Trust. The second held property records for 13 acres of marshfront land beside the foundation's proposed expansion site, land everyone believed belonged to a dormant shell company in Savannah. The third held audio files, email exports, and something labeled Canary. The second folder changed everything. My father had quietly purchased the marsh parcel through an irrevocable trust 8 years earlier after discovering that developers were pressuring local preservation groups to open public shoreline for private event use. He never told me because, according to the trust memorandum, he intended the land to transfer only if any officer, spouse, or relative attempts coercive extraction of Nora Bell's professional position, assets, or inheritance by fraud, duress, or reputational sabotage. My father had built a trap, and my family had stepped into it. The canary clause was explained in a memo from his attorney, Joseph Pike. If anyone who gained access to related documents attempted to disclose the trust improperly, divert associated assets, or use insider knowledge to interfere with Nora Bell's rights, the clause automatically triggered release of preserved evidence to designated legal recipients, including counsel, the state attorney general's nonprofit unit, and the board's outside auditors. There was also metadata. Dozens of emails forwarded from a Foundation archive account to a private address belonging to Elise. Invoice templates edited from Grant's home laptop. Timestamps. IP logs. A donor hospitality ledger manipulated after my surgery. Audio from a dinner 6 months earlier where Grant's voice said, clearly, if Nora is out of the way for 1 quarter, the expansion money moves, the marsh closes, and by the time she notices, it's governance history. Another voice asked, and the sister? Grant laughed. Elise wants visibility. People will do a lot for title. I sat at my dining table until 2 a.m. listening to that clip again and again, not because I doubted it, but because my body needed time to let certainty replace grief. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I called Joseph Pike. He was 73, still practicing, and sounded mildly annoyed to be alive, which I trusted more than warmth. When I mentioned my father's name, he went silent for a beat too long. I wondered when this would happen, he said. He met me at his office near Broad Street, a narrow brick building with floors that sloped toward the windows. He wore a wrinkled seersucker suit and read the trust documents without rushing. Then he removed his glasses and said, "Your father did not create this because he distrusted you. He created it because he understood them." He explained the irrevocable trust. The Marsh parcel was legally mine now as successor beneficiary, but it remained protected from marital claims because it had never been commingled and because the triggering event required fraud against me. The canary clause had not fully released yet because the evidence package was still sealed, waiting for one final threshold, a public governance action taken against me using falsified financial records. Friday's board meeting would do it. "This isn't revenge," I said. "This is justice." Joseph nodded once. "Good. Revenge is sloppy. Justice needs timing." We built strategy mode the way some people build seawalls, one careful section at a time. He pulled in a forensic accountant named Mira Santos, who had the kind of expression that made liars start rehearsing. She traced the money flow in 4 hours. Foundation funds had been pushed through fabricated vendor reimbursements into Bell Harbor strategies. My personal reserve funds had been transferred in as temporary bridge capital using a digital signature authorization submitted from Grant's office computer while I was still admitted post-op. Elise's LLC then paid deposits to an event development entity tied, through 2 holding layers, back to Grant's client network. The scheme was elegant enough to work in silence and stupid enough to collapse under audit. There was one more twist I did not expect. Mira found a series of emails copied to Vivian Mercer, the board chair. Not the full plan, but enough to show she knew questions existed and chose not to ask them because gala sponsorship targets were ahead of schedule. My ally identity twist arrived an hour later when Joseph called someone named Eleanor Voss. I knew the name only as a retired donor who sometimes sent 5-figure checks without attending events. She came into the office that evening in flat shoes and a raincoat, introduced herself, and said, "Your father asked me to sit on the foundation board quietly and keep my mouth shut unless this exact sort of stupidity happened." She was not just a donor. She was the single largest private underwriter of the foundation's educational endowment and one of the only board members with the votes to stop an emergency expulsion. My father had placed an observer inside the system years earlier, not to help me win, to help the truth survive long enough to be seen. Friday's governance meeting was scheduled for noon in the Foundation's Harborview conference room. The gala was the following evening at the Old Customs House, with 300 donors, city reporters, and half the preservation community expected to attend. Joseph advised restraint. Mira advised documentation. Eleanor advised one thing only. "Let them start," she said. People tell on themselves when they think the room belongs to them. So I let them. I arrived at the meeting pale, sore, and dressed more plainly than usual on purpose. Grant was not technically permitted in the room, but he waited outside for support. Elise sat beside Vivian with a leather folio and the expression of a woman already practicing her next job title. I noticed then that the packet in front of each board member contained summary charts, not source documentation. Of course! Vivian opened with institutional sorrow. "We're here under deeply unfortunate circumstances." Elise dabbed at one eye with no actual tears. Then came the small reveal. Vivian presented irregular reimbursements, manipulated credentials, and donor misallocations, all attributed to my oversight. Elise spoke next, voice soft, describing how she had stepped in to protect the foundation from further embarrassment. She used the phrase operational instability twice, which told me Grant had drafted her talking points. Then the bigger reveal. Vivian recommended immediate suspension, formal referral to council, and removal from gala representation pending investigation. One board member actually sighed as if this were hardest on them. Joseph sat beside me and said nothing. I waited until Vivian asked whether I had a response. "Yes," I said. "Please continue." "I think you should finish the whole performance." Her face changed a fraction. She announced a vote. That was the threshold. Joseph slid a sealed envelope across the table to Vivian. "Before any action is taken, the board should review notice of evidentiary preservation, whistleblower complaint, forensic audit findings, and trust trigger disclosure." The room shifted. Mira distributed binders. Eleanor, quiet until then, said, "I move that no vote occur until external counsel reviews the materials in front of you." Vivian looked blindsided. "Eleanor, you haven't even read. I've read enough," Eleanor said. Then came nuclear. Joseph handed Vivian headphones and played the audio file from Grant's dinner conversation through the room speakers anyway because, as he later told me, she was going to hear it eventually, and I dislike theater that wastes time. Grant's voice filled the conference room. "If Nora is out of the way for 1 quarter, the expansion money moves." Nobody spoke during the next 30 seconds. Then Mira walked the board through the money trail, invoice by invoice, IP address by IP address, digital signature by digital signature. She explained metadata so clearly even the least technical donor on the board could understand why a hospitalized woman had not authorized anything from a private wealth office downtown. Joseph explained the Canary Clause and the Marsh Trust. Eleanor disclosed her fiduciary concerns in writing and added, very calmly, that any board member voting on incomplete or falsified materials after receiving contrary evidence would expose themselves personally. I watched Elise during all this. Not Grant. Not Vivian. Elise. Because that was the wound under the wound. She looked less horrified than inconvenienced. When Joseph displayed the LLC filings with her name, she finally spoke. "I didn't know it was illegal. There is a particular kind of silence that follows childish sentences from adults." I said, "You knew it wasn't yours." That landed harder. The meeting adjourned without a vote. Vivian left first. Elise followed. Grant disappeared before security could be asked whether he belonged in the hallway. By 4 p.m. Outside counsel had been engaged, the board had placed Vivian on temporary leave, and the gala, unbelievably, was still scheduled to proceed the next night because institutions would rather limp through public optics than admit blood in the water. Joseph asked whether I wanted to skip it. "No," I said. They chose a public stage. The location twist arrived at 5:30 the next evening in the form of a coastal storm cell moving faster than forecast. Rain hit the customs house windows sideways just as donors began arriving. A power fluctuation killed the uplighting and the check-in tablets for 12 full seconds. Long enough to rattle everyone. Long enough to remind the room that control is often rented, not owned. I was not supposed to speak that night. By the time dessert was served, however, rumors had spread. Vivian was missing. Elise had left early. Grant had been seen arguing in the courtyard with a man from one of his firms. Eleanor rose from her table, crossed the room, and handed the MC a revised card. Then she looked at me. So I walked to the podium. Public set pieces are rarely dramatic from the inside. Mostly they feel like dry mouth and a pulse in your ears. I looked out at donors, city officials, reporters, and trustees, all dressed for heritage and civility, and I understood suddenly that my father had known something before I did. Not that I was strong. That I was precise. "Good evening," I said. I was not scheduled to speak, but since my name has been used extensively this week, I thought I should use it myself. You could feel the room leaning in. I did not rant. I did not accuse wildly. I thanked the teachers, volunteers, and dock workers who made the foundation real. Then I said an internal audit had uncovered financial misconduct involving falsified reimbursements, unauthorized transfers, and conflicts of interest connected to the planned marsh expansion. I informed them that external counsel, a forensic accountant, and relevant state authorities had already received documentation. Small. Then I disclosed that 13 marshfront acres central to the expansion plan were not available for private event development because the land was held through a preservation trust whose beneficiary opposed conversion. Bigger. Then I said, for clarity, that beneficiary is me. Nuclear is not always volume. Sometimes it is identity plus timing. A reporter stood before I finished the sentence. Camera flashes started. Someone at the back said Grant's name out loud to the wrong person. The dramatic irony in the room was almost physical. Half the donors had spent the year being courted to fund a project whose controlling land rights rested with the woman they were about to remove for allegedly mishandling it. I saw Grant then, just beyond the doorway, stopped cold by 2 members of hotel security. He had the same face he wore in photographs, but not the same composure. He looked like a man arriving late to his own exposure. I ended with one sentence. The foundation belongs to its mission, not to anyone's private extraction plan. Then I stepped away from the podium and let the room break on its own. Official consequence came fast because systems move beautifully once enough important people fear being seen standing still. The Attorney General's nonprofit unit opened a review. Grant's firm suspended him pending investigation into financial misconduct and misappropriation of client-adjacent structures. Elise retained counsel and claimed she had been manipulated, which may even have been partly true. Vivian resigned within 48 hours. 2 weeks later, we were in Charleston County Civil Court for emergency motions, asset freeze, document preservation, injunctive relief, and a petition tied to the fraudulent transfer of my personal funds. Grant's attorney tried to frame it as marital misunderstanding layered onto nonprofit confusion. Joseph let him speak until the man ran out of euphemisms. Then Joseph introduced the hospital admission records, the IP logs, the audio, the LLC registry, the forged authorization path, and the trust documents. Mira explained the money trail with surgical calm. Eleanor testified regarding the board process and suppressed concerns. Even Elise, cornered by email timestamps and state filing signatures, admitted Grant told her the money move was temporary. The courtroom went silent. Not because of shouting, because the lie had nowhere left to stand. The judge granted the asset freeze, ordered immediate restoration of my personal funds from reachable accounts, and referred the nonprofit conduct questions for further review. A later settlement handled the house and marital claims more cleanly than Grant had expected. My father's trust remained untouched. The marsh parcel stayed protected. The foundation board was reconstituted over the next 3 months, and I was asked to return under stronger governance terms. I declined. That part surprised people most. They thought victory would mean reclaiming the same chair. But some rooms are only worth surviving, not re-entering. Instead, with Joseph's help and Eleanor's backing, I created the Bell Shore Education Trust using a portion of the recovered assets and income from a conservation lease tied to the marsh parcel. No luxury event platform. No private marina extension. Just wetlands protection, school programming, and a small apprenticeship fund for local boatwrights. Order, not spectacle. Grant's consequences stayed legal and realistic. He lost his position. Several licenses were reviewed. He sold the house he had fought so hard to keep because litigation is expensive when charm stops working. Elise moved to Atlanta after signing a cooperation agreement in the civil matter and has sent me 2 letters I have not answered. My mother called once to say families should not destroy each other in public. I told her families should stop destroying each other in private first. 1 year later. I live in a smaller house near the Ashley River with a porch that catches the evening air and a desk that faces the water. I still save the boring documents. I still wake up some mornings with anger already formed in me like weather. But it passes faster now because anger is heavy and I finally learned not to carry what belongs to other people. On Thursdays, local middle school students come to the marsh for restoration workshops. On Saturdays, I meet with a quiet team that runs the trust. Sometimes Eleanor brings pound cake. Joseph retired in theory and still calls in practice. I keep my father's note in the top drawer of my desk. For when they decide you will fight back. He was right about them. More importantly, he was right about me. The lesson was never that money saves you. It doesn't. Documents help. Boundaries help. Truth timed correctly helps most of all. The real shift came when I stopped negotiating with people who benefited from my confusion. Self-worth is not loud. It is administrative. It changes passwords. It hires counsel. It reads the fine print. It leaves the table when respect is not on it. So here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever had someone mistake your patience for weakness right before everything turned? Tell me where you're watching from, and if stories about quiet justice and earned second lives mean something to you, subscribe. The next one begins with a woman, a probate notice, and a voicemail nobody thought she kept.